The night my son opened his dream bar without me was the night I stopped being the family bank. I didn't know it yet, of course. All I knew was that I was standing in my kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, staring at a dead phone, waiting for a photo that never came. I had spent the last 8 months with sawdust in my lungs and a permanent ache in my lower back, all to help Jason turn a dilapidated warehouse into something he called the Copper Rail. I had been there for every permit, every late-night plumbing disaster, and every panicked call when the contractors threatened to walk. I'd called him at 7 p.m. just to say I was on my way. "Hey kiddo," I said when he finally picked up on the 5th ring. "So, when's the grand opening? I want to make sure I'm there early to help set up. You know, wipe tables, take pictures, embarrass you a little." There was a pause, a long, hollow silence that felt heavier than the 3-ton mahogany bar top I'd helped him hoist into place just 3 weeks prior. In the background, I heard the swell of a crowd, the sharp pop of a champagne cork, and the kind of upbeat indie rock that screams expensive atmosphere. Then, a different voice slid into the line, smooth, sugar-coated, and sharp as a razor blade underneath. "Hi, Mike. It's Tara," my daughter-in-law said. Her voice had that specific tone she used when she was talking to a waiter she intended to stiff on the tip. "The opening was last night." I switched the phone to my other ear, my brain struggling to process the words. "Last night? No." Jason said the soft opening was next week. "I thought tonight was just for the staff to practice." "It was very exclusive, Mike," she cut in, her voice dropping into a performative whisper. "We needed to keep it tight. Investors, local influencers, a couple of lifestyle bloggers, you know, important people. People who can actually move the needle for the business. We didn't want it to feel like a dusty family reunion. We needed a vibe. Only important people." The words landed like a bucket of ice water down my back. I stood there in my faded plaid shirt, the one with the bleach stain on the sleeve from when I helped them scrub the floors, and gripped the edge of my laminate counter until my knuckles turned white. I could hear Jason breathing in the background. I knew that breath. It was the same one he used when he was 10 years old and had broken my favorite fishing rod, a mix of guilt and the hope that if he stayed quiet enough I'd just fix it and move on. "Jason?" I asked, my voice cracking more than I wanted it to. "You there?" "Hey, Dad," he muttered, his voice muffled, likely as he stepped into a back hallway. "Look, Tara's right. It was a branding thing. We're doing a family dinner later this month, okay? I've got to go, the mayor's assistant just walked in. I'll call you tomorrow." The line went dead. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, holding a silent phone that suddenly weighed 100 pounds. Outside, the streetlights flickered on over the cracked sidewalk I'd shoveled for Jason's paper route 35 years ago. I looked around my house, my paid-off little brick box. It was the house my late wife, Laura, had filled with crochet blankets and the smell of cinnamon. On the fridge, a magnet still held up a faded drawing Jason had made in 2nd grade. It was a picture of him and me standing in front of a giant mountain. Underneath, in messy crayon, it said, "My dad can fix anything, but I couldn't fix the hole that was currently opening up in my chest." I had taken $10,000 out of my retirement to help him sign the lease on that warehouse. I had co-signed the small business loan because the bank didn't trust his credit history after the tech startup he tried to launch in his 20s went belly up. I was the one who spent my weekends at Home Depot buying lumber, sealant, and light fixtures on my own credit card because the business account was a little tight this week. I was the silent partner. I didn't know at the time that they took the silent part literally. To them, I wasn't a partner. I was an ATM that also happened to know how to install a subfloor. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my worn recliner, the one with the duct tape on the armrest, and stared at the dark TV screen. My mind was a carousel of every emergency Jason had called me about over the last 4 years. "Dad," the fryer broke. "We'll lose the Friday crowd if we don't fix it. Mike, the liquor license fee was way more than they told us. Can you bridge the gap? Dad, we're a little short on the beer order this month." I always found a way. I canceled my annual fishing trip with my old buddy Miller. I put off fixing my own sagging back porch. I even sold my old '68 Chevy truck, the one I'd planned to restore since 1995, to cover a surprise tax bill for them. I did it because that's what fathers do. You build the foundation so your kids can build the house. But as the sun started to peek through my kitchen blinds, I realized I hadn't been building a foundation. I'd been building a pedestal for them to stand on while they looked down at me. The next morning, at exactly 9 a.m., my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. The important people must have finished their champagne because the ATM was being paged. I picked it up. Hello? Mike, thank God. Tara's voice shrilled through the speaker. The sugar was gone. Only the sharp, entitled edge remained. Listen, the bank just called. The main equipment loan payment bounced. Apparently there was a clerical error with the automatic transfer from your account. You need to call them and authorize the override right now. They're threatening to hit us with a massive penalty, and we have a huge delivery coming at noon. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my lukewarm coffee. I felt a strange, cold clarity settling over me. It was the kind of feeling you get right before a storm breaks, the air gets still, the birds stop singing, and you know everything is about to change. Tara, I said, my voice calmer than it had been in years. What? Mike, hurry up. I'm on the other line with the vendor. Didn't you tell me last night that I wasn't, how did you put it, important? There was a silence on the other end so heavy I could hear her sharp intake of breath. Mike, don't be like that. We were stressed. It was a high-pressure event. You know how Jason gets. Now, about the transfer. I'm sorry, I interrupted, but I've decided to take your advice. I'm moving in a new direction. From now on, I only help important people, and since I'm clearly not one of them, I figured I shouldn't be interfering with your business affairs anymore. What are you talking about? She snapped. Jason, get over here. Your father is being difficult. I heard the phone being fumbled, then Jason's voice, thick with irritation. Dad, come on. We don't have time for a guilt trip. Just move the money, and we can talk about the opening tonight. I'll even let you have a drink on the house. A drink on the house. In the bar I paid for, using the stool I bolted to the floor. No, I said. No, Jason repeated, sounding genuinely confused, as if I'd just spoken a language he didn't recognize. What do you mean, no? I mean, I'm done, Jason. I'm done being the safety net. I'm done being the ghost in the machine. If you're big enough to have a grand opening without your father, you're big enough to pay your own equipment loans. Dad, if that payment doesn't go through, they could put a lien on the equipment. We could lose the kitchen. Jason's voice was rising into that familiar whiny pitch he used whenever things didn't go his way. Sounds like a problem for an important person to solve, I said. Maybe call one of those influencers? See if they can pay your light bill with vibes and likes. I hung up. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel like a failure. I walked over to my kitchen table and pulled out a yellow legal pad. I uncapped a black pen and wrote 2 words at the top. The debt. I spent the next 3 hours going through my bank statements, my credit card bills, and my old loan ledgers. I didn't realize how much I had let them bleed me until I saw it all in one place. Every emergency $500, every bridge loan for the lease, every piece of hardware I'd bought on my own dime. By the time I reached the bottom of the 4th page, I stared at the final number. It was more than a number. It was my entire life's work, distilled into ink and paper. $42,600. That was the price of my son's success. That was the money Laura and I had saved for a cabin in the woods. That was the money that was supposed to keep me safe in my 80s, and they had treated it like it was an infinite spring, all while treating me like the dirt under their expensive new shoes. Just as I was about to set the pen down, my phone lit up again. It wasn't a call. It was a notification from my bank's mobile app. Alert, low balance in savings account. Automatic transfer of $1,500 to Copper Rail LLC was declined due to insufficient funds. My blood went cold. I hadn't authorized a $1,500 transfer for today. I looked closer at the transaction history. They hadn't just been waiting for me to send money. They had set up a recurring pull from my account using my routing number, which Jason had borrowed months ago to help with the initial setup paperwork. They weren't just asking for my help anymore. They were harvesting me. I stood up, grabbed my car keys, and headed for the door. I had a stop to make at the bank, and then I had a stop to make at the hardware store. I was done fixing things for them. It was time to start fixing things for myself. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have possibly guessed, was that cutting off the money was only the beginning. When you stop being a source of income for people like Jason and Tara, you don't just become unimportant, you become the enemy. And they were about to prove just how far they were willing to go to get their bank back under control. I pulled into the bank parking lot, my hands steady on the wheel for the first time in months. I walked straight to the manager's office, Louis, a guy I'd known since Jason was in Little League. Louis, I said, sitting down before he could even offer, I need to freeze everything, and I mean everything. He looked at the screen, then back at me, his expression shifting from professional to concerned. Mike, I see the copper rail transfers. Are you sure? If we stop these now, any pending checks they've written against your overdraft will bounce. It could get ugly for them. I looked out the window at the bright Ohio sun. Luis, I said, it's already ugly. I just finally turned the lights on. I walked out of that bank 10 minutes later with a new account, a new PIN, and a total block on any outside entity touching my money. I felt lighter than air. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw a familiar black SUV speeding in the opposite direction, toward my house. It was Tara, and she didn't look like she was coming over for that family dinner. I saw the dust cloud from her SUV before I even turned onto my street. Tara didn't just drive, she commanded the road, and that black Cadillac was less of a vehicle and more of a weapon she used to announce her presence. I pulled my old Ford into the driveway, sitting there for a moment with the engine idling, watching her pace back and forth on my porch. She was wearing one of those athleisure outfits that cost more than my monthly mortgage. Her blonde hair pulled into a ponytail so tight it looked painful. I'd spent 30 years as a foreman on construction sites. I'd handled men twice my size who were screaming about union dues and overtime. But as I sat there, my heart was thumping in my throat. It's funny how the people who owe you the most are usually the ones who make you feel the most afraid. I didn't know it then, but this was the exact moment the sweet daughter-in-law I'd known for 4 years finally evaporated, leaving behind something much colder. Mike! She shouted before I even had the door open. She didn't wait for me to walk up the path. She met me halfway, her face flushed a blotchy, angry red. The bank just called. They said you've frozen the accounts. They said you've reported the copper rail's recurring transfer as unauthorized. What the hell are you doing? I took my keys out of the ignition and stepped out of the truck, moving slowly. I felt every one of my 68 years in my knees. I'm doing what I should have done 18 months ago, Tara, I said. I'm protecting what's left of my life. Protecting? She let out a sharp, jagged laugh that had no humor in it. You're sabotaging your son's future. Jason is in tears, Mike. He's at the bar right now, trying to figure out how to pay the liquor distributor because you decided to have a temper tantrum over a party invitation. It wasn't a party, Tara. It was the grand opening of a business I funded, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. And it wasn't a temper tantrum. It was a wake-up call. We told you it was for branding, she hissed, stepping into my personal space. She smelled like expensive perfume and desperation. We needed a certain demographic. We needed the cool crowd. You're a retired foreman, Mike. You wear flannel with paint stains. You don't fit the copper rail aesthetic. We were trying to protect the brand so it could actually succeed and we could pay you back. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I'd been a fool for a very long time. I thought back to when Jason first introduced her to me. It was 6 months after my wife, Laura, had passed away. I was a wreck, drowning in a house that felt too big and too quiet. Jason had brought her over, and she had been so kind. She brought me casseroles. She sat and listened to my stories about Laura. She made me feel like I still had a family. But looking at her now, I saw the truth. She hadn't been building a relationship with me. She'd been scouting the terrain. She'd seen a grieving, lonely man with a paid-off house and a healthy 401k, and she'd started digging a well. The aesthetic, I repeated. Is that what you call it? I'm good enough to pay for the artisan reclaimed wood, but I'm too dusty to sit on the chairs I bought. I'm good enough to co-sign a $500,000 loan, but not good enough to have a beer at the bar I practically built with my own 2 hands. You're being sensitive, she said, her voice dropping into that patronizing tone people use for toddlers and the elderly. Listen, Mike, I know you're lonely. I know losing Laura was hard, but you can't let your emotions ruin Jason's business. Just come back to the bank with me. We'll fix the unauthorized flag, and I promise, we'll have that family dinner this Sunday. I'll make that pot roast you like. The pot roast. The $42,600 pot roast. I'm not going back to the bank, Tara, and I don't want the roast. What I want is for you to get off my property. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Her eyes went from concerned daughter-in-law to predator in a heartbeat. You think you're so smart? You signed those papers, Mike. You're a co-signer on the main loan. If the bar fails because we can't make the payments, the bank doesn't just come for us. They come for you. They'll take this house. They'll drain whatever is left in that pathetic savings account of yours. You're not protecting yourself. You're committing financial suicide. Then I guess we'll all go down together, I said. But at least I'll be going down with my dignity. Now, get out. She stared at me for a long beat, her chest heaving. Jason was right, she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. He said you were getting soft in the head. He said you were starting to lose it. Maybe we should have listened to the signs earlier. She turned on her heel and marched back to her SUV, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I stood in my driveway and watched her tires kick up gravel as she peeled away. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Losing it. That wasn't just an insult. It was a threat. I went inside and locked the door. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel quiet. It felt like a bunker. I walked into my small office, what Laura used to call the junk room, and sat at the desk. I needed to see exactly how much trouble I was in. As I dug through the folders, my mind drifted back to the wedding. I should have known then. That was the first time I felt like a stranger in my own family. It was 3 years ago. I'd given them $15,000 for the venue, because Tara just had to have this botanical garden setting. On the day of the ceremony, I found out I wasn't sitting at the head table. I was tucked in the back, behind a pillar, next to Tara's great-uncle who didn't speak English. Whenever I tried to talk to Jason that night, Tara would swoop in and whisk him away for more photos or an important guest. I'd spent the evening watching my only son celebrate the happiest day of his life from 30 feet away, feeling like an uninvited guest at a party I'd paid for. When I mentioned it to Jason the next day, he'd just shrugged and said, "Dad, Tara had a vision, don't ruin it for her." I'd spent my whole life not wanting to ruin it for him. When he was 8 and wanted the expensive hockey gear, I took double shifts at the yard. When he was 22 and crashed his car, I spent my weekends under the hood fixing it so he could get to work. I'd conditioned him to believe that my only purpose was to be the floor he walked on. I found the loan documents for the copper rail. I spread them out under the desk lamp, my eyes scanning the fine print. Tara was right about one thing. I was the primary guarantor. If they defaulted, the bank would come for my blood. But as I read through the terms of default section, I noticed something I'd missed when I signed it in a blur of "I'm so proud of you" tears. There was a clause, Clause 14B. In the event of a suspected fraudulent use of funds or a significant change in the business's financial management, the guarantor has the right to request a full forensic audit and can trigger a temporary freeze of the line of credit to prevent further loss. I wasn't a lawyer, but I'd been around enough contracts to know a leverage point when I saw one. Jason and Tara hadn't just been using my money for the bar. I remembered the business expenses I'd seen on their shared account before I was locked out last month: trips to Aspen, marketing dinners at 5-star steakhouses, a lease on that black SUV Tara was driving. They weren't just building a business, they were funding a lifestyle, and they were doing it with my retirement. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Jason. "Dad, please. Tara told me what happened. You're hurting us. We're family. Please just call Luis and fix the transfer. I'll come over tonight and we can talk. Just you and me. I promise. Please." For a second, the old Mike, the "dad can fix anything" Mike wanted to hit reply. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that if I just gave him one more chance, he'd finally see me. But then I remembered Tara's eyes in the driveway. He said, "You were starting to lose it." I didn't reply. Instead, I did something I hadn't done since Laura died. I went to the kitchen, opened the bottom cabinet, and pulled out a bottle of expensive scotch I'd been saving for a special occasion. I poured myself a glass, sat at the table, and watched the sun set over the yard. I realized that I had lived my life like a pauper so they could live like royalty. I'd kept the same 20-year-old furnace, the same peeling wallpaper, and the same dented truck, all while they branded themselves into a world I wasn't allowed to enter. Around 10 p.m., a car slowed down in front of my house. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, watching the headlights sweep across my living room wall. The car idled there for a long time. I knew it was Jason. I could feel him out there, staring at the house, probably rehearsing the speech that would get him back into my wallet. After 5 minutes, the car moved on. I thought that was the end of it for the night. I thought I could sleep. But at 2 a.m., my home security alarm, the one I'd installed after a string of break-ins on the next block, erupted in a deafening scream. I scrambled out of bed, my heart trying to kick its way out of my chest. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept on the nightstand and ran toward the back door. The glass in the mudroom door had been shattered. A cold wind was whistling through the jagged hole. I stepped into the mudroom, the beam of my light dancing over the shards of glass. "I have a gun!" I yelled, even though I didn't. "I've called the police." There was no answer, only the sound of the alarm in the wind. I looked down at the floor. Resting right in the center of the mudroom rug was a single item that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a brick or a rock. It was a small, framed photo from my hallway. A picture of me, Laura, and Jason at the Grand Canyon. The glass in the frame was smashed, and a thick black X had been drawn over my face with a permanent marker. My hands started to shake. This wasn't a robbery. This was a message. And as I looked at that X over my eyes, I realized that I didn't know my son at all. I didn't know what he was capable of when his lifestyle was threatened. I reached for my phone to call 911, but before I could dial, a new notification popped up on the screen. It was an email from a law firm I'd never heard of. The subject line read, "Notice of intent, petition for legal guardianship and declaration of incompetence." I slumped against the wall, the alarm still screaming in my ears. They weren't just going for my money anymore, they were coming for my freedom. The police didn't stay long. In their eyes, it was a low-priority property crime. A broken window, a vandalized photo, no witnesses, no fingerprints on the jagged glass. One of the officers, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, patted me on the shoulder and told me to get a piece of plywood. He said kids these days were restless. I wanted to scream that this wasn't a kid. I wanted to grab him by the collar and tell him that my own son had likely watched from the shadows as I shook in my own mudroom. But I didn't. I stood there, clutching the broken frame, and nodded until they drove away. The silence that followed was worse than the alarm. I sat on the floor of the mudroom, the cold night air biting at my skin, and looked at that black X's over my face. It was such a precise, hateful mark. It didn't just cover my eyes, it erased me. I realized then that Jason hadn't just grown up to be entitled. He had grown up to be a stranger. I didn't know it yet, but the X on that photo was just the first layer of a much larger, much darker plan they had been drafting for months. I spent the rest of the night pacing the house, my mind a frantic library, pulling out old memories and examining them for signs I'd missed. When did the rot start? I thought back to 5 years ago. Before Tara, before the bar. Jason had a vision for a tech startup called Loom. He said it was going to revolutionize how local businesses managed inventory. He needed $20,000 for a prototype. I didn't have $20,000 in cash back then, so I took out a second mortgage on this house, the house I'd worked 30 years at the rail yard to pay off. The startup lasted 6 months. Jason told me the market wasn't ready, and the developers betrayed him. He never apologized for the money. He just moved on to the next thing. And I, like a fool, told him it was okay to fail. I told him he was brave for trying. I was the one who taught him that my pockets were bottomless, and my forgiveness was unconditional. I had raised a man-child, and then I'd handed him over to a woman who knew exactly how to weaponize his weakness. By 6 a.m., the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a hollow, nauseating dread. I opened the email from the law firm again, petition for legal guardianship. I'm not a stupid man, but legal jargon is designed to make you feel like you are. I read the words diminished capacity, erratic behavior, and protection of assets. They weren't just trying to get the money back. They were trying to declare me a protected person. In the state of Ohio, if a judge signs off on that, I'd lose the right to make my own medical decisions, the right to vote, the right to sell my own property, and the most chilling part, the right to control my own bank accounts. I was 68. I worked out every morning. I did the Sunday crossword in pen. I wasn't diminished. But as I looked at the broken window and the X on the photo, I realized they were already building a narrative. Poor Mike, he's seeing intruders. He's breaking his own furniture. He's freezing his accounts because he's paranoid. I had to move. I couldn't sit here and wait for the important people to come and put a leash on me. I grabbed a hammer and a piece of scrap wood from the garage to patch the window. Every strike of the hammer felt like a heartbeat. Bang, bang, bang. I was halfway through when my neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, walked by with her golden retriever. She stopped at the edge of my lawn, her face pinched with a look I couldn't quite place. "Everything okay, Michael?" she asked, her voice hovering somewhere between concern and suspicion. "Just a little accident, Betty," I said, trying to force a smile. "Someone threw a rock through the glass last night. Just some kids." She didn't smile back. She tightened her grip on the leash. "Jason called me yesterday. He seemed very worried about you. He mentioned you'd been having some episodes lately, forgetting where you parked the truck, getting angry at the grocery store." The hammer felt suddenly very heavy in my hand. My heart skipped a beat. I haven't been to the grocery store in 3 days, Betty, and I always park in the same spot. Oh, she said, shifting her weight. Well, he just said if I saw you acting confused, I should give him a call. He's such a good boy, isn't he? So devoted to you. She walked away before I could respond. My stomach turned over. They were already seeding the neighborhood. They were poisoning the well, making sure that if I ever reached out for help, everyone would just see a confused old man who needed his devoted son to take over. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. I went back inside and called the only person I could think of who might be able to help. My old friend Miller. We'd worked the yard together for 3 decades. He'd seen me at my best and my worst. Miller, it's Mike, I'm in trouble. I told him everything, the bar, the money, the break-in, the guardianship notice. Miller was quiet for a long time. I could hear the familiar sound of him tapping a cigarette on a tin can. Mike, he said finally, his voice gravelly, you know I love you like a brother, but you've been letting that boy bleed you for years. I told you back when you sold the Chevy that you were making a mistake. You can't buy a son's love, Mike. It's either there or it ain't. I know that now, Miller, but they're trying to take my house. They're trying to take my life. Listen to me, Miller said. I've got a nephew. He's a lawyer over in Dublin. He doesn't do that corporate crap. He does elder law. It's a fancy name for protecting old goats like us from our own families. I'll call him. But Mike, you gotta be ready. If you go to war with Jason, there's no coming back. You're gonna lose your son to save your skin. You ready for that? I looked at the X on the photo again. I looked at the empty spot on the wall where Laura's portrait used to hang, a portrait I'd moved into the bedroom weeks ago because I didn't want Jason and Tara's aesthetic to touch it. I already lost him, Miller, I whispered. I just didn't realize the body was still walking around. All right then, I'll call Dave. Meet me at the diner at noon. And Mike, check your mail. The physical mail. My wife said she saw Jason at your mailbox 2 days ago when you were out. She thought he was just being helpful. I hung up and ran to the front door. My mailbox was one of those old-fashioned ones attached to the house. I flipped it open, empty, but when I looked down at the porch, I saw a tiny scrap of white paper caught in the cracks of the wood. I picked it up. It was the corner of an envelope. It had the logo of Columbus Water and Power on it. I scrambled to my computer and logged into my utility portal. I'd set up paperless billing years ago, but I hadn't checked the activity log in months. I scrolled down, my eyes blurring as I searched for anything out of the ordinary. There it was. 3 weeks ago. A request to change the primary contact phone number and email address on the account. The new email wasn't mine. It was tjconsulting@gmail.com, Tara's initials. I looked at the recent charges. My heart stopped. My normal water bill was maybe $60 a month. The last bill? $1,482. I clicked on the usage tab. According to the meter, I had been using 4,000 gallons of water a day for the last 2 weeks. I ran to the basement thinking a pipe had burst, but the floor was bone dry. I checked the yard, no puddles, no soft spots. Then I looked at the outdoor spigot on the back of the house, the one hidden behind the overgrown lilac bushes. I pulled back the branches and saw it. A high-pressure hose was attached to the spigot. It ran over the back fence, tucked under a pile of leaves, and into the storm drain in the alley. The valve was turned wide open, the water screaming through the line as it dumped thousands of gallons directly into the sewer. They weren't just stealing from me. They were intentionally manufacturing a financial crisis. They were going to use these astronomical, unexplained bills as proof in court that I was incapable of managing my own household. Look, Judge, he's letting the water run for weeks. He doesn't even notice the bills. He's a danger to himself and his finances. I reached down to turn off the valve, my hand shaking with a rage so hot I thought I might pass out. But then, I stopped. If I turned it off now, they'd know I'd found it. They'd find another way to hurt me. I needed to let the trap stay open a little longer while I built a cage of my own. I took out my phone and did something I should have done the second I saw that X. I hit record. I filmed the hose, the meter spinning like a top, and the trail leading to the drain. I recorded the date and time. Then, I quietly walked back inside, leaving the water running. I didn't know it yet, but that video was going to be the first brick in the wall I was building around my life. But as I sat at my kitchen table, listening to the sound of my own money pouring into the sewer, a new thought hit me. If they were willing to do this to my house, what were they doing to the bar? What was happening to the $450,000 loan I had co-signed? I pulled out the yellow legal pad and started a new list. This one wasn't for me. It was for a forensic accountant. What happened next, though, changed everything. I heard a key turn in the front door. I didn't have the locks changed yet, Dad. Jason's voice called out, sounding sweet, concerned, and utterly fake. Dad, are you home? We brought lunch. I looked at the legal pad. I looked at the camera on my phone. I realized I wasn't just fighting for my house anymore. I was fighting for my life. And the important people were standing in my foyer. I shoved the yellow legal pad into the junk drawer and slid my phone into my pocket just as the kitchen door swung open. For a split second, I considered charging into the hallway and screaming at them to get out. But 30 years on a job site taught me one thing: never show your hand until the bets are doubled. I took a breath, smoothed my shirt, and leaned against the counter, trying to look as diminished as they wanted me to be. In the kitchen, Jason, I called out, my voice intentionally a little shaky. They walked in like they owned the place. Jason was carrying a white paper bag from a local deli, and Tara was trailing behind him, her eyes scanning the room like an insurance adjuster looking for a reason to deny a claim. She didn't look like the woman who had screamed at me in the driveway 24 hours ago. She had replaced the rage with a mask of soft, practiced pity. "Hey, Dad," Jason said, setting the bag on the table. "We were worried when you didn't answer your texts. We figured we'd bring some lunch over and check on you. You looking okay? You look a little pale." "I'm fine, Jason. Just didn't sleep well. Had a bit of a scare last night," I said, watching Tara's face. She didn't even blink. She just sighed and walked over to the mudroom door, pointing at the plywood I'd just hammered into place. "Oh, Mike, Jason told me about the window. This is what we were talking about, honey. The paranoia. You're starting to imagine people are trying to get in, and now you're boarding up the house like a bunker. It's not safe for you to be here alone if you're going to be this reactive." "I'm not imagining the glass on the floor, Tara," I said, "and I'm not imagining the photo that was smashed." "What photo?" Jason asked, his voice a little too quick. "The one of us at the canyon." Someone drew an X over my face. Jason looked at Tara, then back at me, shaking his head with a look of profound sadness that would have won him an Oscar if the audience didn't know he was a thief. "Dad, we looked at that frame. There's no X. The glass just cracked because the house is settling, and you must have scratched it when you were cleaning it up. You're seeing things that aren't there again." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. They hadn't just broken the window. They had come back in while I was at the bank or the hardware store and replaced the vandalized photo with a different, clean one. They were erasing the evidence of their own cruelty in real time, rewriting my reality right in front of me. I realized then that if I fought them on it, if I showed them the video on my phone, they'd just say I'd faked it or that I was obsessively documenting delusions. "Maybe you're right," I whispered, looking down at my hands. "Maybe I'm just tired." "We know you are," Tara said, her voice dripping with artificial honey. She walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. I had to fight the urge to flinch. "That's why we're here to help. We've been talking to a wonderful specialist, a doctor, Eris. He specializes in transitions for seniors in your position. We think it would be great if you just sat down and had a chat with him." "Transitions," I repeated. "You mean a nursing home? A luxury senior living community," Tara corrected. "The copper rail is doing so well, Mike. We want to use some of the profits to make sure you're taken care of. You wouldn't have to worry about the bills or the maintenance or, well, the water." My heart stopped. She had slipped. She mentioned the water. I hadn't told them about the water usage yet. "The water?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the deli bag. Tara paused, her fingers tightening on my shoulder just for a fraction of a second. "You know, the utility bills. Jason said you were complaining about the costs last month. In a community, everything is included. No more stress." She was good. She was fast. But I'd spent my life reading blueprints, and I knew a structural flaw when I saw one. I didn't know it yet, but that slip of the tongue was the thread that would eventually unravel her entire beautiful aesthetic life. "I'll think about it," I said, sat down, and reached for a sandwich. "How's the bar, Jason? The important people keeping the register full?" Jason's face darkened for a second, a flicker of the old insecure boy I knew passing through his eyes. "It's great, Dad. Really. We're the talk of the North Side. We've got a line out the door most nights. We're actually thinking about expanding already, maybe a second location in Short North." "Expanding?" I asked, mid-bite. "With what money? You just told me yesterday you couldn't make the equipment loan payment." "That was just a temporary cash flow glitch," Jason said, waving a hand dismissively. "We've got new investors interested, high-level guys. but they want to see that the family side of things is stable. They don't like liabilities, Dad. And a co-signer who's freezing accounts and filing unauthorized reports. That looks like a liability. So that's what this is about, I said, setting the sandwich down. The meat tasted like ash. You need me to sign the guardianship papers so you can tell your high-level guys that you have full control over the assets. It's for your protection as much as ours, Jason snapped, his patience finally wearing thin. If the bank sees you're acting erratic, they'll pull the whole line of credit. Everything we've worked for, everything you worked for will vanish. Do you want that? Do you want to be the reason I lose everything? It was the same old song, the same guilt trip melody he'd been playing since he crashed his first car. It's your fault if I fail. I looked at him, my only son, and I didn't see a man. I saw a parasite that had finally realized its host was fighting back. I don't want you to lose anything, Jason, I said, and for once, I wasn't lying. I want you to earn something, for the first time in your life. The room went silent. The concerned mask on Tara's face didn't just slip, it rotted away, revealing the jagged, ugly ambition underneath. She leaned across the table, her voice a low, lethal hiss. Listen to me, you stubborn old man. We gave you a chance to do this the easy way. We brought you lunch. We offered you a luxury suite. But if you want to play foreman and give orders, you'd better realize you're not on a job site anymore. You're in our world now. We've already spoken to 3 of your neighbors. We've documented your confusion. We have the records of your unexplained utility usage. If you don't sign those papers by Friday, we're going to the court with an emergency petition. And when the judge sees what we have, you won't be going to a luxury community. You'll be going wherever the state puts the people who can't take care of themselves. She stood up, grabbing her designer bag. Come on, Jason. He needs time to process how alone he really is. They walked out, the front door slamming so hard a picture frame actually did fall off the wall this time. I didn't move. I sat there in the silence of my kitchen, the half-eaten sandwich sitting on the table like a corpse. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, followed by a cold, sharp anger that started in my toes and worked its way up to my throat. They thought they had me. They thought they had the neighborhood, the bank, and the records to bury me night. But they forgot one thing. I was the one who taught Jason how to build. And if you know how to build something, you know exactly where the load-bearing walls are. You know exactly which beam, if cut, will bring the whole roof down. I didn't know it then, but the high-level investors Jason mentioned were the key. I had to find out who they were. Because if they were as important as Tara claimed, they probably wouldn't like the idea of their brand being tied to a couple of people who were committing elder abuse and utility fraud to stay afloat. I waited until I heard their SUV roar away. Then I went back to the mudroom and checked the water spigot. It was still running. I left it. I went to the basement and pulled out an old, dusty trunk I hadn't opened since Laura died. Inside were the journals she'd kept. She was a meticulous record keeper, much like I used to be. I dug through the bottom of the trunk until I found what I was looking for, a small, black USB drive. 2 years ago, Jason had used my computer to work on some business plans for the bar. He thought he'd deleted everything when he was done, but I'd set up a secondary backup drive back when I was worried about losing my old photos of Laura. Everything he'd done on my machine, every email, every spreadsheet, every private message to Tara was tucked away on that drive, waiting for me. I plugged it into my laptop, my heart hammering. I scrolled through the folders until I found one labeled Project Copper, Investor Deck. I opened it and began to read. What I found wasn't just a business plan. It was a roadmap of a massive, multi-level fraud. They hadn't just been using my money for the bar. They had been using my co-signature to secure secondary loans from private lenders, loans I'd never seen, loans that were currently being paid back using the business expenses I'd noticed on my statements. But there was something else. A name kept popping up in the emails. V. Rossi. Rossi is getting impatient. One email from Tara to Jason read, if we don't show him the full control documents by next week, he's going to pull the plug and call in the collateral. We need the old man's signature, Jason. Do whatever it takes. Collateral. I looked at the date of the email. It was the same day I had sold my Chevy truck. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting a guardianship petition. I was caught in the middle of a high-stakes squeeze play. Jason and Tara had borrowed money from someone they couldn't pay back, and they were planning to use my house, my pathetic little brick box, as the payout. Suddenly, a heavy thud sounded from the front porch. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of something large being dropped. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. There was no one there, but a large wooden crate was sitting on my welcome mat. It was draped in a black cloth. I opened the door, the cold air hitting me like a physical blow. I pulled the cloth back, and my breath hitched. Inside the crate was the neon sign from the front of the copper rail. It was shattered into 1,000 orange and blue shards. Taped to the broken glass was a small, elegant business card. It didn't have a name on the front, just a phone number and a single handwritten sentence on the back. "He says you're the one with the money. We'd like to talk about the debt." I looked down the street. A dark sedan was idling at the corner, its headlights off. I realized then that while Jason and Tara were trying to declare me incompetent, they had accidentally introduced me to the people they were truly afraid of. The important people had arrived. And they didn't want a vibe. They wanted their $400,000. I didn't go back inside. I didn't hide behind the plywood. Something in me, that old, rusted-over foreman's grit, finally snapped into place. I'd spent my life building things that were meant to stand against the wind, and I'd be damned if I let a dark sedan and a broken neon sign blow me over in my own front yard. I walked down the porch steps, the crunch of the glass under my boots sounding like bone, and I marched straight toward that idling car at the corner. The sedan didn't move. It sat there, a low, black shadow against the orange glow of the streetlights. As I got closer, the driver's side window slid down with a soft, expensive hiss. The man inside wasn't a thug out of a movie. He was mid-50s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a watch that probably cost more than my first 3 houses. He had silver hair swept back and eyes that looked like they'd seen every lie ever told and found them all boring. "Mr. Callahan," he said. His voice was like velvet over gravel. "I was beginning to think you weren't the man your son described." "And how did he describe me?" I asked, stopping a few feet from the door. I kept my hands visible but my chest out. The man, Victor Rossi, I assume, tilted his head. "He said you were a relic." A stubborn, slightly confused old man who was clinging to a past that didn't belong to him anymore. "He said you were a financial bottleneck that needed to be bypassed." A bottleneck. That's what I was to my own flesh and blood. Not the man who taught him to ride a bike, not the man who paid for his college, but a pipe that needed to be cleared so the important people could flow. "I'm the man who owns the house your son just put up as collateral," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I'm the man who co-signed the loan you're currently trying to collect on. And I'm the man who's going to tell you to get your car off my street before I call the sheriff." Rossi smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a leather-bound folder. He flipped it open and held a single sheet of paper up so the streetlight could hit it. "I don't think you understand, Mike. Can I call you Mike?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Your son didn't just put up the house. He showed me a power of attorney, signed and notarized 3 months ago. It gives him full authority over your real estate assets in the event of your incapacity. And according to the documents his lovely wife sent me this morning, that incapacity has been officially documented by their legal counsel." My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. I stepped closer, squinting at the paper. There it was, my signature, the loops of the M, the sharp tail on the N. It was perfect. It was also a lie. I remembered the day 3 months ago when Jason had brought over a stack of boring tax forms for the bar. "Just some internal stuff, Dad. We need to verify the primary guarantor's residency for the state. Just sign the bottom of these 4 pages. I had been watching a baseball game. I had trusted him. I had signed my own death warrant while eating a bowl of popcorn." "That's a forgery," I whispered. "In the eyes of a bank, it's a contract," Rossi said, pulling the paper back. "I've put $400,000 into the copper rail, Mike. I didn't do it because I like artisan cocktails. I did it because I like real estate. This neighborhood is gentrifying. This pathetic little box of yours, it's on a double lot. It's worth more as a teardown for a modern duplex than it is as your home. Jason knows that. Tara definitely knows that. They're selling my home to pay you? They're liquidating an underutilized asset to ensure the long-term viability of the brand," Rossi quoted, sounding amused. "But here's the problem. I don't like messy legal battles. I don't like guardianship petitions that take months to move through the courts. I want my money now. And since you're the one currently blocking the accounts, I figured we should have a man-to-man talk." "What kind of talk?" "The kind where you realize that your son has already moved on," Rossi said. "He's already picked out your room at that luxury community Tara mentioned. He's already signed the preliminary sales agreement for this lot. If you fight this, you'll spend your last few pennies on lawyers and end up in a state-run ward with nothing. If you sign over the deed tonight, I'll personally ensure you get $100,000 in cash under the table so you can go find a quiet place to fish and forget you ever had a son." I looked at him, and for a second, the sheer weight of the betrayal almost crushed me. My son hadn't just been draining my bank account. He had been measuring my grave. He had already sold the roof over my head. "I have a better idea," I said, leaning into the window. I could smell his expensive cologne. "How about you get off my property, and I give you 24 hours to realize that the important people you're dealing with are two-bit frauds who couldn't run a lemonade stand without their father's credit card? If you think they're going to pay you back once I'm gone, you're the one who's confused." Rossi's smile disappeared. The window began to slide up. 24 hours, Mike. After that, I stop being a businessman and I start being a creditor. And creditors don't care about family dynamics. The sedan roared to life and pulled away, leaving me standing in the dark, surrounded by the smell of exhaust and the sound of my own shattered life. I didn't go to sleep. I went to the basement. I pulled out my old work boots, my heavy-duty tool belt, and a pry bar. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a foreman, and it was time to inspect the job site. I drove to the copper rail at 3 a.m. The street was empty, the vibes replaced by the cold, industrial silence of the warehouse district. I used the service key. I'd kept the one Jason forgot I had. I slipped inside, the smell of expensive wood and stale beer hitting me. It was beautiful. I'll give them that. The lighting was perfect, the bar top glowed, and the aesthetic was worth every penny of my stolen retirement. But I didn't go to the bar. I went to the manager's office in the back. The door was locked, but I knew the hinges on these doors better than anyone. I had them off in 3 minutes. I sat at Jason's desk, the leather chair feeling like a throne of lies. I turned on the computer. I didn't need to guess the password. It was the name of our old dog, Buster 123. I spent the next 4 hours descending into the heart of their darkness. I found the emails to Rossi. I found the forged power of attorney files. But then I found the special expense folder. It wasn't just Aspen trips. It was a wire transfer history to an offshore account in the Caymans. $60,000 had been moved out of the bar's startup fund, my money, into an account under Tara's maiden name. She wasn't just spending the money, she was hiving it off. She was preparing for the day the bar failed. She was planning to leave Jason with the debt and me with the dirt, while she vanished with the profit. And then I found the legal folder. My heart nearly stopped. It was a draft of a testimony from a Dr. Aris, but it wasn't a medical report. It was a script. Patient exhibits signs of late-stage onset dementia, aggressive towards family, delusional regarding finances. Taped to the digital file was a scan of a check made out to the doctor for $5,000, labeled consultation fee private. They hadn't just spoken to a specialist, they had bought one. I was downloading everything onto my USB drive when I heard the front door chime. Someone was here, at 7 a.m. I ducked behind the heavy velvet curtains in the corner of the office. Through the gap, I saw them. Jason and Tara. They looked exhausted, their important people glow faded in the harsh morning light. "Rossi called," Jason said, his voice cracking. He was pacing the small room, his hands shaking. "He said he went to the house. He said Dad didn't blink. Tara, he's not going to sign. We're dead. Rossi is going to take the bar, and he's going to come for us." "Shut up, Jason," Tara snapped. She was sitting at the desk, her face a mask of cold, hard steel. "He's a 68-year-old man with a high-stress history. We don't need him to sign the deed. We just need the emergency hearing to happen on Friday. Once the judge sees the water bills and the doctor's report, the temporary guardianship becomes active and becomes/pieces immediately. I've already talked to the realtor. The house goes on the pocket listing market Saturday morning. We'll have Rossi's money by Tuesday." "But what about Dad?" Jason asked, his voice small. "Where does he go?" "The facility has a secure wing for patients with aggressive tendencies," Tara said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "He'll be safe. He'll be fed. And he won't be able to ruin our lives anymore. He's my father, Tara. He's a liability, Jason. Choose. Do you want to be a good son in a homeless shelter, or do you want to be the owner of the hottest bar in the city? Because you can't be both." Jason stopped pacing. He looked at the empty chair where I had just been sitting. He looked at the mahogany bar through the open door, the bar I'd helped him build. "Okay," he whispered. "Do it. Call the lawyer. Tell them we need the hearing moved up to tomorrow. Tell them it's an emergency. Tell them he's becoming a danger to the neighborhood." They left a few minutes later, the heavy door clicking shut behind them. I stepped out from behind the curtain, the USB drive clutched in my hand like a grenade. I felt a tear run down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. It was the last bit of Dad leaving my body. What was left was the foreman, and the foreman knew that when a structure is this rotten, you don't try to repair it. You perform a controlled demolition. I walked out of the bar and straight to my truck. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I called Miller's nephew, Dave, the elder law attorney. Dave, I said, my voice as hard as the gravel under my tires. I have the evidence of the forgery. I have the proof of the medical bribery, and I have the offshore account records. How fast can you get a cease and desist and a counter petition in front of a judge? If you have all that, Dave asked, his voice sharpening with professional hunger. I can have a process server at their door by noon. But Mike, if we do this, it's not just a civil case. This is criminal. Your son could go to prison. I looked at the X over my face on the photo I'd brought with me. I looked at the broken neon sign in my rearview mirror. He already put me in a cage, Dave, I said. I'm just returning the favor. But there's one more thing. I need you to find out who Victor Rossi really is. Because I think I'm about to make him an offer he can't refuse, and it's going to cost my daughter-in-law every penny she's ever stolen. I hung up and pulled into my driveway. But as I reached for the door handle, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. A white van was parked in front of my house. 2 men in scrubs were standing on my porch, talking to Mrs. Higgins. She was pointing at my front door, her face full of that same pity I'd seen earlier. They weren't waiting for the hearing. They were here for the emergency pickup. Tara had moved the clock forward, and I was standing in the middle of the street with nothing but a USB drive and a hammer. I didn't run. I didn't put the truck in reverse and peel out like a guilty man. If there's one thing I've learned from 30 years of managing crews, it's that the person who panics first is the one who loses the contract. I pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, and sat there for a long, slow count of 10. I tucked the USB drive deep into my sock, a trick I'd used to hide cash on rough job sites, and gripped the handle of my heavy flashlight. I stepped out of the truck, my boots hitting the gravel with a deliberate, steady thud. The 2 men on the porch turned to look at me. They were big, not the kind of big that comes from honest labor, but the kind that comes from protein shakes and intimidation. They wore clean white scrubs with a small embroidered logo on the chest. Greenwood Heights. That was the place Tara had mentioned. The secure wing. Michael Callahan? The taller one asked. He had a voice like lukewarm milk, designed to be soothing but tasting like nothing. That's me, I said, walking toward them. I didn't look at them. I looked at Mrs. Higgins. She was standing on the sidewalk, clutching her dog's leash so tight her knuckles were white. Betty, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Oh, Michael, she whimpered, her eyes darting to the men. Jason called. He said you'd had a breakdown. He said you were threatening to hurt yourself. These gentlemen said they're here to take you somewhere safe. Somewhere you can get help. I felt a surge of cold, white-hot fury, but I kept my face as flat as a plywood sheet. Is that what he said, Betty? That I'm a threat to myself? We have an emergency transport order, Mr. Callahan, the milk-voiced man said, stepping down off the porch to meet me. Signed by your next of kin and authorized by a Dr. Aris. It's for a 72-hour observation. Just a little rest, some tests. No reason to make this difficult. He reached for my arm. It was a practiced move, meant to be gentle but firm. I stepped back. Not a frantic retreat, but a tactical shift. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and hit the live stream button on my social media, a feature my granddaughter had shown me months ago that I'd never used. Stay back, I said, my voice projecting the way it did when I was shouting over a jackhammer. I am currently broadcasting live. If you touch me without showing me a court-ordered warrant signed by a judge, not a consultation note from a bribed doctor, you are committing a felony. It's called kidnapping. And since you're on my private property, I have the right to defend myself. The man froze. The soothing mask flickered, revealing the confused bully underneath. He looked at the phone, then his partner. They weren't used to 68-year-old men knowing their rights, let alone how to broadcast them to the world. We have a medical directive, the second man growled, his voice much less soothing. You have a piece of paper bought with a $5,000 bribe, I said, stepping toward them now. I know about the payment to Dr. Aris. I know about the Project Copper files. And I know about the $60,000 Tara moved to a Cayman account yesterday. Does Jason know about that yet? Or is he still under the impression that he's the one in charge? The silence that followed was beautiful. It was the sound of a carefully constructed lie hitting a structural failure. "Mrs. Higgins gasped, her dog barking at the tension in the air. "Now," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. "You're going to get in that van, and you're going to drive away. If you're still in front of my house in 60 seconds, I'm calling the sheriff to report an attempted abduction, and I'll be sending the video of your faces and your license plate to every news station in Columbus." They didn't wait 60 seconds. They traded a look of panicked realization and retreated to the van. They knew they weren't law enforcement. They were private contractors for a luxury facility, and they weren't paid enough to end up on the evening news for snatching a man off his own lawn. The van sped away, tires shrieking, leaving a cloud of exhaust hanging in the air. I turned to Mrs. Higgins. She looked horrified, her hand over her mouth. "Michael, I didn't know." Jason sounded so sincere. "That's his talent, Betty," I said, my heart finally starting to slow down. "He's a very sincere liar. Go home. Lock your doors. This is about to get very ugly." I didn't go inside. I got back in my truck and drove straight to Miller's nephew, Dave. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel. But my mind was a laser. I realized that the emergency Tara had tried to manufacture was her last-ditch effort. She was desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. I met Dave in a small, nondescript office in Dublin. He was a sharp-eyed man in his 30s, who didn't waste time with small talk. I handed him the USB drive and told him about the van, the X on the photo, the water bills, and Rossi. Dave plugged the drive into his computer and started scrolling. He didn't speak for 20 minutes. The only sound in the room was the clicking of the mouse and the hum of the air conditioner. Then he looked up, and the expression on his face was one I'll never forget. It was the look of a man who had just found a winning lottery ticket in a trash can. "Mike," he said, leaning back, "this isn't just a guardianship dispute. This is a RICO case in the making. The offshore account transfers, that's money laundering. The bribe to heiress, that's medical fraud. And this power of attorney." He pointed to the screen where the forged document was displayed. "If we can prove you were at a different location the day this was supposedly notarized, Jason and Tara aren't just losing the bar. They're going to federal prison." "I was at my doctor's office that day," I said, "getting my annual physical. I have the receipt in my glove box." Dave smiled, a cold, predatory thing. "Then we don't just file a counter petition, we file a criminal complaint. But there's one problem, Mike. Victor Rossi. If he has a lien on your house based on this forged document, he's going to move to foreclose the second he hears the law is involved. He'll want to get his collateral before the state seizes everything." "Not if I talk to him first," I said. "Mike, that's dangerous. That man isn't a businessman, he's a shark." "I've spent 30 years working with sharks, Dave, usually the kind that wear hard hats and carry union cards. I know how to talk to someone who only understands the bottom line." I left Dave's office with a stack of legal documents and a new sense of purpose. I didn't go home. I knew home wasn't safe. I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, paid in cash, and sat on the edge of the bed with my phone. I had one call to make. "Rossi," I said when he picked up. "It's Mike Callahan, don't hang up. I'm currently looking at a spreadsheet of $60,000 Tara moved to a private account in the Caymans. Money that was supposed to be part of your $400,000 investment. She's been skimming the startup funds since day one." There was a long, cold silence on the other end. "Go on," Rossi said. "She's planning to skip out, Victor. She's making Jason look like the fall guy while she builds a nest egg for herself. And that house? The power of attorney you're holding is a forgery. My lawyer has the proof. If you try to foreclose on it, you'll be tied up in litigation for the next 10 years, and you'll likely be investigated for conspiracy to commit fraud. Are you threatening me, Mike?" "No," I said. "I'm making you a partner. I don't want the bar. I don't want the lifestyle. I want my house, and I want my retirement back. You want your $400,000. I have the evidence that can put Tara away for 10 years. If she goes down, the state seizes the bar. But if you help me, if you testify that you were misled by her and you provide the records of the private loans she solicited, we can make sure the important people are the ones who end up in a secure wing." "And what do I get?" Rossi asked. "You get the bar," I said. "I'll sign over my interest as the co-signer to you, legally and cleanly, once the fraud is exposed. You get a turnkey operation in a gentrifying neighborhood for the price of the debt. You can fire Jason, hire a real manager, and turn a profit in 6 months, but only if you help me bury her." I could hear him thinking. Wow. I could practically hear the gears of his calculator turning. Rossi didn't care about me. He didn't care about Jason. He cared about the $400,000. Meet me at the bar tomorrow morning, Rossi said. 7 a.m. Before they open. Bring your lawyer. And Mike? If this is a setup, you'll wish you'd stayed in that van. I hung up and slumped against the motel wall. I had just made a deal with the devil to save myself from my own son. The thought made me want to throw up, but then I remembered the way Jason had looked at me in the kitchen, the way he'd looked at the bar instead of at his father. I didn't sleep that night either. I spent the hours watching the clock, waiting for the sun to rise on the final day of my old life. I felt like a man walking toward a demolition site, ready to push the plunger. The next morning, the air was crisp and cold. I met Dave at the corner, and we walked toward the copper rail. Rossi was already there, leaning against his sedan, his face unreadable. We didn't exchange greetings. We walked inside using Rossi's key. The bar was silent. The morning light filtered through the high windows, making the dust motes dance over the expensive mahogany. It looked like a temple built to a god that didn't exist. At 7:30 a.m., the front door opened. Jason and Tara walked in, laughing about something. Tara was holding a latte, her face bright and confident. She looked like the queen of the world. Then, she saw us. She stopped dead. The latte slipped from her hand, the paper cup hitting the floor with a wet, heavy thud. The white foam splattered across her expensive boots, the same boots I'd seen her wearing while she talked about my aggressive tendencies. "Dad?" Jason stammered, his face going from confusion to terror in a heartbeat. What are you doing here? Victor, why is he here?" "We were just discussing the aesthetic, Jason," I said, stepping out from behind the bar. I felt a strange, cold peace. "It's a little too rotten for my taste. I think it's time to take it down to the studs." Tara recovered first. She always did. She lunged for her bag, but Rossi's hand was already on her arm. "Not now, Tara," he said, his voice like a funeral bell. "I'd like to hear more about this account in the Caymans. It's a very important detail I seem to have missed." Jason looked at Tara, then at me, then at the lawyer. He realized then that the roof was already falling. "Dad, please," he whispered. "We can fix this. We can talk." "I'm done talking, Jason," I said, "and I'm done fixing things for you. The only thing I'm fixing today is the record." I looked at the son I had raised, the son I had loved, and I didn't see anything but a stranger. And then, I saw the man standing behind them, a man in a plain suit with a leather portfolio, the process server. "Jason Callahan? Tara Callahan?" the man asked. "You've been served." He handed them the papers, the counter-petition, the criminal complaint, and the emergency restraining order. But as Tara reached for the papers, she did something I didn't expect. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She looked at Jason with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You idiot," she hissed. "I told you we should have moved him last week." She turned back to me, her eyes like chips of ice. "You think you've won? You're an old man, Mike. You're still the one who co-signed the main loan. If this place goes under, you're still the one the bank is going to eat alive. You've just committed suicide." "Actually," Dave said, stepping forward, "we have one more document for you to see. It's an affidavit from the bank's forensic unit. They've been tracking the unauthorized transfers for the last 48 hours. And they've found something very interesting in your personal banking history, Tara." He held up a final sheet of paper. "It's not just Mike's money you've been taking," Dave said. "You've been embezzling from the bar's payroll taxes too. That's a state crime. And the person who reported it? Well, they're standing right behind you." I looked toward the door. Mrs. Higgins was there, but she wasn't alone. She was with Luis, the bank manager. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't about the money or the bar. It was about what Tara had been doing in the dark, even to the man she claimed to love. The silence in the bar was so thick you could have cut it with a framing saw. Luis, a man I'd trusted with my meager savings for 2 decades, stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking on the reclaimed wood floor I'd spent 40 hours hand-sanding. He didn't look at me with the usual, "Hey, Mike," warmth. He looked like a man who had spent his morning staring into a digital abyss and didn't like what stared back. "It's true, Tara," Luis said, his voice flat and clinical. "When you tried to initiate that emergency transfer from Mike's account yesterday, the one you claimed was a pre-authorized medical necessity, it triggered a red flag in our compliance department. Because Mike had already flagged the account as compromised, I didn't just block the transfer, I opened the hood on every account linked to your social security number. Tara's face, usually so composed, so on brand, began to twitch. It was a small movement at the corner of her eye, the first sign of the foundation cracking. She tried to pull her arm away from Rossi, but his grip was like a steel vise. "You had no right," she hissed. "I had every right," Luis countered. "Especially when I found the secondary ledger. You weren't just skimming from the startup funds, Tara. You've been withholding the employees' federal tax contributions for 6 months. You were filing the paperwork, but the money wasn't going to the IRS. It was going into an escrow account under a shell corporation called Linden and Vine. And 3 days ago, you initiated a wire to move that entire balance, nearly $85,000, to a bank in Georgetown." I looked at Jason, my son. He looked like he'd been hit by a freight train. His mouth was open, his eyes darting between his wife and the bank manager. This was the man who had stood in my kitchen 24 hours ago and told me I was the one who was confused. He was the one who had agreed to put me in a secure wing to save the business. "Tara?" Jason's voice was a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. "What is he talking about? Linden and Vine? That's the consulting firm you said we needed for the branding. You said that money was for the influencer campaign." Tara didn't even look at him. The disgust on her face was so profound it made my skin crawl. "The influencer campaign, Jason. Honestly, you are more delusional than your father. There is no campaign. There is no second location in Short North. This bar is a sinking ship. It's been bleeding money since the second week because you can't manage a lemonade stand, let alone a high-end cocktail lounge. You spend more on research at strip clubs and steakhouses than we make in a month." But you said we were the talk of the city," Jason stammered. "I told you what you needed to hear so you'd keep signing the papers I put in front of you," she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I needed the time to build a life for myself that didn't involve a man-child who needs his daddy's credit card to buy a pair of shoes. I was leaving, Jason. I was leaving the second the old man's house hit the market. I had my ticket. I had my account. I was going to let you and Rossi fight over the scrap wood while I was on a beach. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just a father being betrayed by a son. It was a husband being gutted by the woman he'd sold his soul to satisfy." I watched Jason crumble. He literally slid down the front of the bar, his knees hitting the floor, his head in his hands. He started to sob, not the quiet, dignified grief of a man, but the messy, loud wail of a child who finally realized the stove was hot. I should have felt triumphant. I'd spent weeks being gaslit, threatened, and nearly kidnapped. I'd seen my own son draw an X over my face. But looking at him there, broken on the floor of the monument he'd built to his own ego, I just felt a deep, hollow exhaustion. I felt like a foreman looking at a collapsed bridge. It doesn't matter whose fault it is when the rubble is 10 feet high. "Get him up," Rossi said to the man in the suit. He looked at Tara with a clinical kind of interest. "You were going to steal from me, Tara. That was your plan? To leave me holding a forged power of attorney and a tax evasion investigation while you tanned in the Caribbean?" "I was doing what I had to do," she spat. "I wasn't going to let these two anchors drag me to the bottom. Mike is a relic, and Jason is a failure. Why should I suffer for their incompetence?" Rossi didn't answer her. He looked at me. "Mike, your lawyer is right. This is a mess. But I'm a man of my word. I want the bar. I don't want the drama. The forgery makes the lien on your house void, but I need you to testify to that in open court so I can clear my own name from the fraud. If you do that, I'll release the house today." "And what about them?" I asked, gesturing to the ruins of my family. "The police are in the parking lot." Dave, my lawyer, said quietly. He checked his watch. "We gave them the 20-minute window to let us get the primary statements. The embezzlement from the IRS is a federal matter. The attempted kidnapping and medical fraud, that's state. They won't be going to a luxury community, Mike. They'll be going to the county lockup." I looked at Jason. He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. "Dad, please." I didn't know. I didn't know she was stealing from the taxes. I thought we were just trying to get ahead. I didn't mean for the van to come. She said it was just for a checkup. She said you were sick. "Please, Dad, don't let them take me." I walked over to him. I knelt down so I was at eye level, the same way I used to when he was a little boy and had fallen off his bike. I remembered the smell of the grass, the way he'd grab my thumb and stop crying because he knew I'd fix it. "My dad can fix anything," the drawing on the fridge had said. "I can't fix this, Jason," I said, my voice cracking. "I can't fix a man who doesn't exist. You didn't just lose your father, son. You lost yourself. You let her erase me, and in the process, you erased the man I raised you to be. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I know you are, I said. But sorry doesn't rebuild a house, and it doesn't unsign a forgery. I stood up and turned my back on him. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every instinct in my body, the 30 years of shifting loads and protecting my crew, told me to grab him, to shield him, to take the hit for him. But I knew that if I did, I'd be burying both of us. The door opened, and the sunlight flooded in, silhouetting the officers. They didn't come in with guns drawn. They came in with handcuffs and the quiet, heavy authority of the law. They walked straight to Tara first. She didn't struggle. She just looked at me with that same frozen mask of hate. As they led her out, she leaned in and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "You're still going to die alone in that house, Mike. Nobody is coming to save you." Then they went for Jason. He didn't fight either. He just looked at the floor as they clicked the metal shut around his wrists. He looked so small, so fragile, like a structure built without a single load-bearing beam. When the room finally cleared, it was just me, Dave, Luis, and Rossi. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of a standoff. It was the silence of a graveyard. "You okay, Mike?" Luis asked, putting a hand on my shoulder. "I will be," I said, though I didn't know if I believed it. "Dave, I need you to follow through with the bank. I want the house cleared by noon. And Rossi, the bar is yours. I'll sign the papers tonight. Just make sure you change the name. I don't want to see that neon sign ever again." "Consider it done," Rossi said. He looked around the beautiful empty room. "I think I'll call it the Foreman's. It has a better ring to it." I walked out into the bright Ohio morning. I didn't go to the motel. I didn't go to the police station. I drove to the cemetery. I sat by Laura's grave for 3 hours, the wind whipping the dry leaves around my boots. I told her everything. I told her about the bar, the money, the X on the photo, and the look in Jason's eyes when the handcuffs clicked. I felt like I was waiting for her to tell me what to do, but for the first time, the silence was just silence. I realized then that I had been living for a ghost and a parasite. I'd been keeping a house for a family that didn't want me and a legacy for a son who didn't exist. I stood up and wiped the dirt from my jeans. I felt a strange, cold clarity. I wasn't an unimportant person. I wasn't a bottleneck. I was Michael Callahan. I had a hammer, a pry bar, and $42,000 worth of hard-learned lessons. I went home. I walked up to the back of the house, behind the lilac bushes. The water was still running, screaming into the storm drain. I reached down and I turned the valve. Click. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. But as I walked back toward the front door, I saw something that made my heart stop. A small, white envelope was tucked into the frame of the front door. I opened it. It wasn't a legal notice. It wasn't a threat. It was a Polaroid photo. It was me, sitting on my porch, taken from the bushes across the street. I was holding the hammer. On the back, in a handwriting I didn't recognize, were 5 words that changed everything. He wasn't the only one. I looked at the street. It was empty. But as I stared at the photo, I realized that Tara wasn't the only one with an exit strategy, and Jason wasn't the only one with a secret. I walked inside and locked the door. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark and I waited, because the demolition wasn't over. I had just found the second basement, and I knew exactly whose name was on the deed. I sat in the dark for a long time, the Polaroid resting on the kitchen table like a taunt. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of a home at rest. It was the expectant, vibrating silence of a structure that had been hollowed out from the inside. He wasn't the only one. The words on the back of the photo looped in my mind, a riddle written in someone else's malice. For years I'd thought of this house as my sanctuary, the place where Laura and I had built our world. But as I sat there, I realized I'd been living in a house of cards. I'd focused so hard on Jason and Tara, the visible termites, that I'd missed the rot in the foundations. I looked at the photo again. The angle was too low to be from a car. It was taken from the ground, likely from the dense thicket of hydrangeas that bordered my yard and Mr. Davis's property. Mr. Davis, the neighbor who had testified that I yelled at phantoms. The man who lived in a house half the size of mine but drove a brand new Lexus. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need them. I knew every creak in the floorboards of this house. I walked down to the basement, but I didn't stop at the workbench or the laundry area. I went to the back, under the stairs, where the old coal chute had been sealed off decades ago. There was a loose brick there, one I hadn't touched since Laura passed. Behind it wasn't a second basement in the literal sense, but a fireproof box Laura had insisted we keep for the day the world stops making sense. I pulled it out, the metal cold and heavy. I'd always assumed it held our original marriage license and some old bonds. But when I opened it and turned on my flashlight, zoomed at manila envelope labeled in Laura's elegant looping script, "For Michael, open only when the gravity fails." Inside was a ledger I'd never seen. Laura had been the one who handled the bills while she was alive, and she'd been far more observant than I'd ever given her credit for. There were notes dating back 10 years. June 14th, Jason asked for $5,000 for the app. He didn't look me in the eye. Checked the credit card, he'd already used the emergency number for a hotel in Vegas. There were dozens of entries like it. My heart ached. She'd been protecting me from the truth about our son for a decade, trying to fix him in the shadows so I wouldn't have to see the man he was becoming. But the final entry was the one that made my blood turn to ice. The 12th of March 2015. Caught Mr. Davis in the garden, looking at the property stakes. He didn't know I saw him. He's been talking to Jason about the easement. Michael doesn't know, but the city wants to widen the alley, and the payout for the double lot is huge. Davis and Jason are planning to split the difference if they can get Michael to vacate. I've moved the deed to the safe deposit box at the downtown branch. Do not trust the neighbor. Do not trust the son if he comes with a smile. I slumped against the cold stone wall of the basement. The "he wasn't the only one" note made perfect sense now. It wasn't just Jason and Tara, it was the neighbor. It was a coordinated effort to strip me of the one thing I had left, my land. The episodes and the confusion weren't just a play for my savings. They were a play for a real estate payout that Davis had been orchestrating for years. I didn't wait for morning. I called Miller's nephew, Dave, and told him what I'd found. "Dave," I said, "check the city planning records for the Broad Street Alley expansion. See who filed for the easement compensation." He called me back 20 minutes later. "Mike, you're not going to believe this. A company called Davis and Associates filed a joint claim with TJ Consulting, Tara's firm, 6 months ago. They were claiming the property was already in the process of a title transfer due to owner health issues. They were going to split a $200,000 city payout the second you were moved into that facility. The foreman in me took over, the part of me that knew how to coordinate a massive project, how to ensure every bolt was tightened and every beam was true. I had the forgery evidence, the embezzlement proof, and now the motive for the neighborhood-wide gaslighting. The next day, I didn't go to the police. I went to Mr. Davis's house. I didn't knock politely. I pounded on the door until he opened it, looking startled in his silk bathrobe. "Michael, what's the matter? Are you having another moment?" "No, Howard," I said, stepping past him into his foyer. I held up the Polaroid. "I'm having a realization. I know about the easement. I know about the joint filing with Tara. And I know you're the one who's been taking photos of me to build a case for my insanity." His face went gray. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. And here's how this is going to go," I said, my voice as hard as a steel joist. "You're going to call the city planning office and you're going to withdraw that claim. Then, you're going to sign a statement for my lawyer admitting that you and Tara fabricated the reports of my unstable behavior in exchange for a cut of the land sale. If you don't, I'm not just going to the police, I'm going to Rossi. And Rossi doesn't use lawyers to settle debts." It was a bluff. I had no intention of involving Rossi in a violent way, but Davis didn't know that. He knew Rossi's reputation, and he knew he'd been caught. He started to shake. "It was Tara's idea, Mike. She said you were going to lose the house anyway. She said Jason was on board." "Sign the paper, Howard," I said. By that afternoon, the house of cards hadn't just collapsed. It had been incinerated. With Davis's confession, the last piece of the guardianship petition was dead. My lawyer filed the final motion to dismiss, and for the first time in months, I was legally, undeniably, and permanently a free man. But the real resolution didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened at the county jail. I went to visit Jason 1 week before his trial. I sat behind the glass, looking at the man I had spent 35 years trying to build. He looked older, smaller, the important person bravado completely gone. "Dad," he whispered, pressing his hand against the glass. "They're saying I could get 5 years. Tara. She's blaming everything on me. She's saying I forced her to do the transfers. Please, you have to tell them I didn't know." I looked at his hand, then up at his face. "You did know, Jason. You knew when you signed that forged power of attorney. You knew when you let them send a van to take me away. You knew when you watched water you didn't pay for dump into a sewer just to make your father look crazy. I was desperate, he cried. We're all desperate sometimes, son, I said quietly. But some of us choose to work, others choose to steal. You chose to erase the person who loved you most. Are you going to help me? I took a deep breath. This was the final cut. No, Jason, I'm not. I've already paid for your mistakes. $42,000 in cash and a lifetime of trust I'll never get back. You're going to serve your time, and when you get out, you're going to find a job, a real one where you have to sweat for your dinner. And maybe, in 10 or 20 years, you can come find me and tell me the name of the man you've become, but until then, don't call me. I stood up and walked away. I didn't look back, even when I heard him calling my name. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of a small, quiet cabin on a lake in northern Michigan. I'd sold the brick box in Columbus to Rossi. He'd turned it into a high-end duplex, just like he'd planned, but he'd paid me a fair price for it, enough to replenish my retirement and then some. I'd kept the double lot payout for myself, a final gift from Laura's foresight. The air here was different. It smelled of pine and cold water, not exhaust and betrayal. I had a new truck, a Chevy, just like the one I'd lost, and a dog named Buster, who didn't care about vibes or branding as long as he had a tennis ball and a spot by the fire. Miller came up to visit me every other weekend. We'd sit on the porch, drink the good scotch, and talk about the old days at the rail yard. We didn't talk about Jason. We didn't talk about the bar. One evening, as the sun was dipping below the tree line, Miller looked over at me. You ever regret it, Mike? Tearing it all down? I watched a hawk circle over the water, its wings steady against the wind. I thought about the important people and the neon signs and the $42,600. I thought about the man who had almost been erased. No, I said, and I meant it. You can't fix a rotten structure, Miller. Sometimes you just have to clear the lot and start over. And for the first time in my life, I liked the view. I leaned back in my chair, the wood solid and true beneath me. I wasn't a bank. I wasn't a safety net. I was a man who had finally finished the most important job of his life. I had built a home for myself, out of the ruins of a ghost. And as the stars began to poke through the Michigan sky, I realized that I wasn't alone at all. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was free. How does that resolution feel to you? Does the cabin by the lake sound like the peace Mike finally earned?